AI Never Sleeps. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Ash Bennington, joined as always by Mikhail Voloshin. Mikhail, welcome back.
In my head, I'm hearing the intro music that we haven't decided on yet. This is one of our earliest episodes, but we're just getting into the groove here.
Yeah, getting into the groove.
Exactly. One of the things I saw in the news cycle today that's actually really useful is GPT now natively supporting image processing. This is big news to some and confusing to others. It's confusing to people mostly because hasn't GPT been doing image processing for a while? Well, no. What's been going on is whenever you ask GPT to draw you a picture, it's always outsourced to DALL-E. So it's just giving you DALL-E's output and it can't even see the image that it's sending you until this week, at which point now you can ask GPT to create its own images. It's doing it itself, and the quality is substantially better.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you that. So, first of all, what's the difference between DALL-E and Chat GPT in the first place? And second, you alluded to this a little bit that the quality of the image is better, but what's the ultimate result of this change?
The ultimate result is that the images are a lot better at actually being the thing that you describe them to be. So DALL-E, man, I might embarrass myself for this. I'm 90% sure it's a diffusion model or something closely related. The point is that it associates words with sort of pixel clouds, sort of noisy pixel clouds, and then reconstructs images by iteratively processing those pixel clouds until they more and more resemble images represented by those words. However, it does not have the same power as a transformer does for understanding grammar, nuance, the structure of subject versus object, that kind of thing. So if you were to describe a scene to a diffusion model, it doesn't understand it by varying definitions of the term understand as a transformer does. What GPT is doing now is incorporating the ability to output images directly into the transformer model itself, so that the same underlying neural connections that are handling the understanding of words and the development of new sentences are now also directly feeding into where to put pixels on an image.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's funny. I was actually joking around with my girlfriend over the weekend, and she said, "Well, make me a varsity letter jacket." And I went on to Chat GPT, and I had it create this varsity letter jacket with some words on the back, and it looked really great. But there was something about it, Mikhail, that was a little bit off, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And then I realized that it had put the jacket pockets on the back of the jacket. It's just like these weird little sixth finger kind of hallucination type of scenarios that seem to come up in the prior models or the prior way that it was handling that image generation. Is that something now with switching from DALL-E to ChatGPT proper natively is the goal to avoid those kind of artifacts?
It'll be less frequent, and certainly OpenAI is trying to make there be less of those artifacts. But at the end of the day, this modification does not solve that problem. The only thing that's going to be able to solve that is the ability for the AI to iteratively modify its own image output. In other words, it has to be able to look at the image that it just drew and pick little parts of it and be like, wait, no, that doesn't look right. Just like a human artist would, frankly. It's a lot easier to do that when the transformer is directly in the loop. And in fact, this dramatically improves GPT's ability to just modify a part of an image as opposed to a holistic operation where with DALL-E it has to modify the entire image as a whole. If it's incorporated into a looping process, into an iterative drawing process, then yes, it will help. If it's just left to its own devices as kind of a one-shot, then you're going to have the same problems with this as you always get with these technologies whenever you've got them outputting words as they generate them. It's going to emit a hallucination and then have to stick to it.
Mikhail, no sooner did you say this does not solve that problem than while you were talking, I actually opened up a window with ChatGPT and it copied and pasted the same prompt. And actually, as it turns out, those pockets on the rear of the jacket disappeared.
Freaking tastic.
So
So
there you
yeah,
go.
one thing that you could not do with DALL-E is give GPT an image and say like draw this image but with the face turned 45 degrees or something like that, or like draw this
Right.
image but have there be a cat sitting. Oh, well, look at that, she's right there. The point is that you couldn't do that with DALL-E. DALL-E would generate images holistically, shall we say. And the interface between DALL-E and GPT was they could only communicate by way of GPT's own prompts. So this integrates the process of generating that image directly into the comprehension pipeline. So you're going to be a lot better at getting stuff like that.
So in other words, if you said, "Hey, draw me a suit coat," and you said, "Perfect, I love that suit coat," but instead of having 3 buttons, draw it with two, it would essentially have to redraw the entire image, and it wouldn't take the output from the prior image and use it as an input. It was just a totally different process. It was literally starting from scratch every time.
Exactly. The way that DALL-E used to work, you would have GPT, you would say to GPT, "Hey, GPT, draw me a picture of a pirate." And then GPT would have to generate a prompt for DALL-E behind the scenes, and then DALL-E would generate the image of the pirate. If you gave GPT an image of an existing pirate and said, "Put his hook on the other hand," what it would have to do is use its words to describe a completely new image of the pirate that it would then pass as a prompt to DALL-E.
But it was a different pirate. It was a different
Correct.
pirate. It just started from, essentially from scratch again. So this is really interesting. It seemed that sort of was the kind of functionality, the way you would need this to work if this was going to be something that was going to be really useful at scale. I mean, otherwise, a human artist, right? You pay an artist to draw something, "Hey, this is great, Bob, but can you erase this line and make the hair blonde," right? Whatever it is that you want to do.
Right.
And the human artist can do it. It's a huge weakness.
Exactly. The bottom line with this news, I think, Ash, is that this makes AI image processing work a little bit closer to how people hypothetically expect it to work. The gap between how people think an intelligent machine should behave and how it actually behaves just got a little bit smaller.
Well, I've said this, many times before. I think it's very important for people to understand that we are working with version 0.0.0.1. This is so early on. I mean, this is, if you want to make metaphors to other technologies, we're not even at the AOL days yet.
Right. This is a point at which this technology is viable for use by the consumer public with a lot of caveats. Those of us who are old enough to remember that the internet was a thing that you could theoretically connect to as long as your mom didn't pick up the phone. Like, you had to maintain your own device drivers, and when the computer crashed, it's, the onus was on you. Like, that kind of stuff. That's still the sort of the clunkiness of the technology that we're dealing with here. And if
Right.
anything, we've been so spoiled about computers and phones and whatnot just magically working nowadays that to have a new technology that doesn't just magically work feels like it's really robbing us of some functionality. But the truth is that it's just going to continue to evolve and get to be more of a product that the consumer can just take for granted.
Yeah, if you're a nerd of a certain age, you'll remember 8N1. If you're not, Google it and be grateful that you never had to live through that era.
Oh, 8N1. I can't whistle, but, I knew many people that could precisely mimic the connection sounds of a 57.6 kilobaud modem.
I think I could do it just to if you want to establish the connection and get like a handshake. I think I could do that just by squeaking into the phone.
Dude. Yeah.
And now the musical interlude of this conversation is complete. Let's talk about some other stories in the news cycle. Bill Gates out with some comments, getting a lot of buzz.
Yeah, about 3 jobs that will survive the AI revolution. I think it depends on what time scale you're talking about. What were the 3 jobs, or 3 fields rather? Medicine, coding, and what was the third one?
But I was hoping you'd forget one of the other ones.
Oh, shoot. Well, one of us is going to have to look it up while the other one is busy talking.
I think it was biology. I think he said all the biological sciences, including medicine. Energy expert. That's the third one. Energy expert.
That's an interesting choice. I would, so one of my clients actually was hiring me to use AI to help them decide where to install solar panels. They would take into account not only the physical properties of the area that they wanted to install in, but also jurisdictional considerations, what power companies already exist, how the electricity there already is generated, and so on. They're already at a point where AI is not exactly replacing that job, but is making significant strides where humans are lacking a little bit. And by the way, the reason is that the reason they wanted me to use an AI to help them is because it's a mammoth amount of data. Because, if you want to cite a new solar installation and you're taking stuff like legislative kickbacks and local energy prices adjusted by season into account, like, that's a lot of variables at play. So my point is, I'm intrigued that he said energy expert, because, I don't see that surviving the AI revolution, frankly.
One of my friends had a great snarky line about this. I sent her the article, and she's a lawyer, and she said, considering that Bill Gates missed professional athlete, I guess that he's probably made some other mistakes as well. And I think I'm probably going to retire as a lawyer long before this ever takes effect.
I think it's important to remember that Bill Gates has expertise in software development and business management. And it's important not to assume that his expertise in those fields extends to anything else, including economic forecasting.
Yeah, very well said, Mick.
I am, however, intrigued that he put software developer on there. And maybe that's him trying to sort of save grace for himself. Because, once upon a time, he was a young, wee little coder.
I have this vague recollection. Nobody quote me on this. This is just my memory. I'm not saying it's true, but I have a recollection of Bill Gates saying like 20 years ago, in 5 years, computers are going to write software better than humans ever can. And it's really interesting because there was some color that he gave around that comment where he said essentially, look, it's going to be a labor saving, and I'm paraphrasing here just from my recollection of reading the article. It's going to have some labor saving capacity for software developers, but they're not going to be totally out of the loop. And I suspect that's probably true of a lot of fields.
AI will not take your job. The guy using AI to magnify his own productivity will take your job. And so labor saving is exactly right, not just in software, but also just across the board.
That one all the time, by the way.
But it's something that bears repeating on this podcast. Those who are going to be binging these episodes are going to be probably hearing that at least once per episode. Those tuning in for the first time should hear it at least once. So the reason why it intrigues me that he says software engineering or coding in general is for a couple of reasons. One is that a lot of people are under the impression that AI is going to take coding jobs. What it's doing to the software industry, even now, even in the last 2 years, is really kind of shocking. There is going to be a serious dearth of talented programmers about 10 years from now, because all of the junior dev positions are being filled by AI. Like, I myself am super guilty of this. Like, I no longer outsource to lower ranked colleagues or to kids fresh out of college. They will do in days what GPT will do in seconds. So there's simply no need to go out and look for them and ask them and explain the problem to them and whatnot. Now, this is great for senior coder productivity, but it prevents junior coders from becoming senior coders. So the question of what this is going to do to the entire industry is really kind of terrifying. When guys like me start retiring, I don't know what software engineering is going to look like. I do have some opinions about it, and I think they're rather interesting if I do say so myself.
Tell me a little bit more about that. Keep going at this, Mikhail.
So I have found that the best way that I can explain it, and all of my geek friends out there and fellow gamers will understand this, intelligence up to programming up until very recently, up until the advent of automated coding bots, has been an exercise in the intelligence skill trait. You have to know how your algorithms work on a fundamental level. You have to be able to code your data structures. You have to be able to design efficient algorithms and whatnot. Less so in the last decade or so when hardware has just been available to compensate for bad coders.
Right.
But that's neither here nor there. The point is that with AI, the chief attribute required for coding is wisdom, not intelligence. Wisdom and charisma, frankly. I don't know if these Dungeons & Dragons stats mean anything to you, but the point is that you have to be able to communicate your intent to the AI and have some understanding of how it'll fit into the big picture. That does take intelligence, but intelligence is a secondary attribute for that. If you let the AI handle the intelligence parts, you just have to focus on what it is that you're developing from an application level.
Yeah, let me ask you this, and this is an interesting question that maybe generalizes a little bit more on this point. This is a real sort of a conundrum, which happens is you have the folks who are in the workforce now who are mid-career, and you're saying essentially you're outsourcing, you're not mentoring, you're just partnering with artificial intelligence. So what happens to the labor market in, 20 years or whenever you decide to shuffle off to Palm Beach, Florida, or wherever you're headed next and kick your feet up on a deck chair? What happens to the next generation who would be getting this mentorship were it not for artificial intelligence?
Pretty clear, Ash. I'm not going to end up in Florida. My retirement involves a cabin in the woods somewhere in Montana with a typewriter. But the question still stands of what happens to these kids, right? And where I'm going with this is that it fundamentally changes who is a programmer, what the personality type and intrinsic skill set is of the kind of people who go into programming as a career. It's less a matter of being able to assemble data structures and understand what the machine is doing on the level of its transistors or its gates. Programming a computer becomes like how you write a program, quote unquote, for the holodeck on Star Trek Next Generation. You describe what you want. You iterate with the computer in a matter of back and forth communication. You ask it to revise what it's built. You have to have some understanding of testing and seeing things from the user's experience type of point of view. But it honestly becomes a lot more artistic, a lot more creative, and a lot less left brainy of a workflow.
Well, what's interesting about that is that you're describing a very different type of skill set. I mean, I guess you could make this to say which is easier, which is harder, but that's really maybe not the best way to describe it. It's really about it requires a different type of skill set, a different type of personality, maybe a different type of person or individual in that seat doing that type of work.
So let me offer an analogy just came to my mind, one of the metaphors that I often go back to. What does it mean to design a machine? And let's look at that concept over the course of several centuries. Who were the people that were creating our technology over the course of vast periods of time? If you go to the Middle Ages, the skill set required to be a blacksmith and to be able to physically assemble the machines that you're working with required being able to pound the metal with the strength of your own hand and endure the heat of the forge. It required strength, it required dexterity, on top of requiring the kind of intelligence that's needed in order to understand like what a certain volume of metal is going to do after it's subjected to such and such forces. Fast forward to the mid 20th century, and a machinist did not require any of the physical endurance required of a blacksmith. So the fundamental physical attributes that were needed in order to perform this task were removed from the requirements of the closest equivalent job. Operating a drill press or a lathe was a fundamentally different motion and required different kinds of mentalities than hammering upon an anvil. Fast forward to the late 20th, early 21st century, a machinist, the closest equivalent job, at least once you pass a certain tech level, doesn't even involve dealing with physical components at all. Then at some point, you're designing in a CAD CAM system, and you've got a 6-axis arm that's carving out your machine components for you. At that point, all you need is the ability to click a mouse and to see what your CAD software is doing. In the same vein, the question of what it takes to be a computer programmer, what it takes to be able to work with this machinery is going to fundamentally change over the course of the next few decades. If we look at who it was that was building computers and programming computers from the 1960s to the 2060s, it's going to be a radically bigger change than what we saw in who builds our technology and who develops our machines from the years 1300 to 2000.
Yeah, that's very well said. I mean, you think about the difference between what it required to be a portrait painter versus a photographer, just a different type of person to focus.
Exactly. So what's going to happen to the career of computer programmer? It's going to absorb a lot more of the people who are now very technically minded artists and writers and playwrights and other creative folks. Those who really approach the craft, those who approach art as an engineering exercise already. That kind of personality is going to become who the computer programmers of the future are. And
But
what
here's the
happens to
challenge,
the
the thing that's a little scary, right? Which is the rate of change, the rate that
yeah.
this technology is developing, right? If you talk about the Industrial Revolution was not something like, oh, yeah, it started. Okay, it's over. It was a gradual industrialization over centuries, not decades, centuries. And if you were in a job and you were mid-career, you could probably be pretty content that that job was going to exist. It was going to be phased out. Maybe you'd get less hours, but you probably weren't going to wake up one day and find that maybe the career exists, but it takes 80% less labor because the top 20% at using the tool, using the AI tool, are now doing the work. Two people are doing the work of 10.
The career still exists, but it changes so drastically that you are no longer the right person for it if you are the right person for it now. From the Middle Ages to the Renaissance through the Industrial Revolution, you're absolutely right. Like if you had a career, you could reasonably be secure in that career through your lifetime. What
Right.
changes is you can't rely on your son necessarily being able to go into the same guild as you did. That's something that you lose that you lose the ability to take for granted over time. That's a very different thing than what we're currently facing.
Yeah,
I don't
exactly.
know. I don't know what the vast majority of people who are talented coders today will do 15 years from now. If you're a talented coder and also a skilled writer and a skilled painter and, you've got a little bit of acting chops, then you might be okay. If you specialized entirely in left brain operations, I don't know what's going to happen to those jobs. But fortunately, you can start trying to get yourself a little bit more creative now. And you know what? You've got good tools for it. GPT can recommend some good books for you.
Yeah, and I think some of it's just also just age dependent, right? If you're 55, maybe you're not that worried about it. But
Right.
boy, if you're 25, that's a challenge. But the flip side, as you point out, is you've got time to make the pivot. You've got time to invest. And that is the very reason why we're doing this podcast and having these conversations so we can start to give people the information and the tools that they need to just begin to expand the way they think about these issues.
I think the folks in their like from 35 to 45 are probably in the worst possible position right now. The folks that are younger than that can still retool their skill sets. The folks older than that don't care. Like they're going to be out before before this thing really takes their careers away. But the folks who are in that like 35 to 45 range are going to they're going to be in a terrible position because right during the absolute peak of their earning years, that's exactly when these jobs are going to be just completely disappearing.
Yeah, that's the challenge. That's the risk. And those are the types of issues that we're here to talk about. Mikhail, as I said, it's been a busy week in news flow. Anything else on your mind?
You know, I do keep seeing stuff crossing my news feed. One of the key reasons why we do this podcast is because if you just keep up with news of AI, then you're going to be absolutely overwhelmed with breaking technology, like new companies announcing new breakthroughs and whatnot. The reason we do this podcast is because 99% of news is going to mean nothing a month from now, 6 months from now, and so on. Yes, breakthroughs are occurring, but only the breakthroughs that actually matter and that actually pan out. That's a little bit more of a culling process. One thing that has been popping up on the radar more recently is humanoid robotics. Humanoid robots that we used to call androids before android used to mean these guys. Back in sci-fi days, there's a company in China that begun prototyping replacing their entire car manufacturing assembly line with humanoid robots. Now, robotics have been employed in high-end manufacturing for 2 generations now, if not more. Real CAD CAM type with sensors and whatnot. The automation of assembly lines with robots is nothing new. The reason that humanoid robotics starts becoming a game changer to this is because existing manufacturing environments are completely built for the purposes of accommodating a human workforce.
Right.
So, like, instruments are placed in a way where humans can access them. Catwalks are built in a way where humans can walk up to them. And so when you have an existing manufacturing process and you want to retool it for full automation, up until 5 years ago, you have to retool your entire factory floor. You have to completely redesign this in the entire manufacturing process in order to figure out where the robots are going to fit. And when I say robots, I usually mean like, swivel arms and 6-axis, drills and spray painters and whatnot, right? If you have an anthropomorphic robot in your, at your disposal, you don't have to retool any of that. All you have to do is give them the same drill or the same spray gun or the same whatever tool you had given your human, and you just show the robot this is what a human is doing, and the robot can use its visual processing systems to see what the human's doing. You can just tell the robot, do that. That completely removes the obstacle to automation that made it cost prohibitive for most processes. So
Right.
we're going to see many more factories that have been relying on human labor start to do a lot more stuff with these robots that are beginning to hit the scene in the upcoming year or so.
Yeah, and this is this interesting idea of the mixed environment where you essentially have robots and humans performing on the same assembly line, performing similar tasks under the same factory floor. It's really just an interesting one. Mikhail, these conversations always spark so much curiosity, interest for me. Every time I have one of these, I want to do another one with you.
Likewise, Ash. I think that's a lot to pack in for one episode. I think that our viewers' brains are full at this point. Hopefully, next time we'll be accompanied by a third person who never sleeps, not an AI.
A real
But
flesh and blood person.
really hope so. And either way, I look forward to seeing you next time, Ash. And until then, get some sleep because AI won't.